This is the story of Pinnacle Airlines Flight 3701. On the 14th of October 2004, a Bombardier CRJ-200 was on a repositioning flight from Little Rock Airport to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. This was a repositioning flight, meaning that there weren't any passengers on board today's flight. The sole reason for today's flight was to get the plane to St. Paul. The plane departed Little Rock at 9:21 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Shortly after takeoff, when the plane was still at 450 feet, the pilots pitched the plane up sharply, taking the nose up to 22 degrees and pulling about 1.8 Gs during the maneuver. The plane started to climb at almost 3,000 feet per minute, prompting the safety nets on the plane to activate. The automatic systems activated the stick shaker and the stick pusher, after which a full nose down was commanded. The plane climbed out at a much slower rate to their planned cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. The plane climbed, and at about 9:25 p.m., as the plane approached 14,000 feet, the autopilot was switched on, and from the ATC transcripts and the CVR, we know that the pilots swapped seats. Almost 2 minutes later, the crew disengaged the autopilot at about 15,000 feet. The crew again pulled the column back, putting the airplane in a 17-degree nose-up attitude. The climb rate exceeded 10,000 feet per minute as the plane screeched upwards. The plane was now experiencing about 2.3 Gs of load. The plane was being flown in a way that it was not meant to be flown. They climbed, and as they leveled off at 26,400 feet, the crew pointed the nose up again, this time climbing at over 9,000 feet per minute. At 9:35 p.m., the crew of the plane asked ATC for clearance to climb to 41,000 feet, well in excess of their planned 33,000 feet. As it turns out, this was the absolute ceiling of the CRJ-200. The plane would not be able to go any higher. ATC allows the plane to climb to 41,000 feet. At 9:48 p.m., the first officer says, "Man, we can do it, 41 it." At 9:51 p.m., the first officer can be heard saying, "There's 410, my man." They had done it. They were cruising at 41,000 feet, and the first officer laughs and says, "This is great." The plane had started the climb at 203 knots, and now at cruise, they were at 163 knots. The captain leaves his seat to get his co-pilot a soda. At 9:53 p.m., Kansas City ARC-TCC comes on and asks the crew if they're flying a CRJ-200. The captain acknowledges. The controller says, "I've never seen you guys up at 41 there." The captain replies with, "We don't have any passengers on board, so we decided to have a little fun and come up here." He adds, "This is actually our service ceiling." At 9:54 p.m., the first officer says, "We're losing here. We're going to be coming down in a second here." The first officer was drawing attention to the fact that the plane could reach 41,000 feet, but it could not sustain it for long. The captain says, "Yeah, that's funny we got up here, but it won't stay up here." At 9:54 and 32 seconds, the captain radios, "It looks like we're not even going to be able to stay up here. Look for maybe 390 or 37. 4 seconds later, the stick shaker activates. Their speed had now slipped to 150 knots, and they had an angle of attack of about 7.5 degrees. They were in the thin air of the upper atmosphere and losing speed in a nose-up attitude. In about 10 seconds, the stick shaker and the stick pusher activated 3 times. Adding to their troubles, fan speed on both engines were dropping. At 9:57 p.m., the stick pusher had activated for a 4th time. Even with the stick pusher, the nose of the airplane crept up, and the angle of attack was at 27 degrees, and the pitch was at 29. Flight 3701 was stalling. In the stall, the plane began to roll to the left, with the left wing in an 82-degree wing down attitude. The pitch of the plane now dropped to negative 32 degrees, and engines 1 and 2 flamed out. At 9:55 p.m., the captain radios declaring emergency, "Stand by." After the transmission, the crew wrestled the plane back under control. They had the plane under control by about 34,000 feet, but they weren't out of the woods yet. Engines 1 and 2 were still down. Control asks the crew to maintain 24,000 feet, and the captain acknowledges. At 9:55 p.m., the FDR cuts out as the dying engines were not powering the FDR anymore. The co-pilot says, "We don't have any engines." The captain replies with, "Double engine failure." The crew start the checklist for double engine failures. The checklist says that if they were above 13,000 feet and below 21,000 feet, they should try a windmill restart, which needed the plane to be at 300 knots. The general idea was to use the airflow to spin up the turbines of the engines to facilitate a restart. At 9:59 p.m., with the APU supplying power, the FDR comes back online. The plane was at 29,200 feet and it was at 178 knots. At 10 p.m., the crew were ready for a windmill restart. The captain asks the co-pilot to get the speed up to 300 knots. The plane pitches down and accelerates to 200 knots. But they still needed more speed, so they pitched the plane down at negative 7.5 degrees, and the speed climbs to 236 knots. Not enough for a windmill restart. At about 10:01 and 51 seconds, the captain stated, "We're not getting any N2 at all, so we're going to have to go down to 13,000 feet. We're going to use the APU bleed air restart procedure." They were now trying to use the APU bleed air restart procedure to get the engines up and running. The controller then asked for them to state the nature of their emergency. The captain responded, "We had an engine failure up here, so we're going to descend down now to start our other engine. We're descending down to 13,000 to start this other engine." The controller replied with, "Understand, controlled flight on a single engine right now." The crew then attempted 4 APU-assisted restarts, but nothing worked. The engines were still dead. The controller asks where the crew wanted to land. The captain says that he's going to restart the other engine. The controller lets the captain know that Jefferson City Memorial Airport was up ahead. At 10:09 p.m., the captain asked the co-pilot to ask the controller for direct vectors to an airport as they have no engines right now. The co-pilot informs the controllers about the double engine failure for the first time. The controllers asked if they wanted to land at Jefferson City Memorial Airport. The captain says, "Any airport, any airport." The first officer told the controller, "Closest airport, we're descending 1,500 feet per minute. We have 9,500 feet left." The controller then proceeded to give the crew information about an ILS approach onto runway 30 at Jefferson City Memorial Airport. After all, the crew did not know where the airport was, and with a bit of directional guidance from the controller, the crew finally had the runway in sight. It was 10:14 p.m., and the co-pilot told the captain that he had the runway in sight. The captain asked the co-pilot where the runway was, and then he says, "We're not going to make it." He adds, "Is there a road? We're not going to make this runway." The pilots turned the plane towards a lit section of highway. The captain says, "Let's keep the gear up. I don't want to go into houses here." At 10:14 and 53 seconds, the plane drops off radar. It was now 930 feet and was too low to be picked up on radar. In the cockpit, the pilots knew that the plane was going down. EGPWS warnings blared in the cockpit. The captain says, "We're going to hit houses." And then at 10:15 and 6 seconds, the sound of impact was picked up by the CVR. The plane hits the ground outside Jefferson City. Unfortunately, both pilots were killed in the crash. Looking back at the flight, there were multiple points of interest. The climb to 41,000 feet was very interesting to the air crash investigators. But why did the pilots want to hit 41,000 feet in the first place? Pilots of the airline had told investigators that many pilots had expressed curiosity about operating the plane at 41,000 feet, and that a 410 club existed in the airline at the time. The investigators also took note of the 3 aggressive pitch-ups that the crew made as they climbed to 41,000 feet. To quote the report on the aggressive pitch-up maneuvers, the pilot's intentional maneuvers, which were not required for any operational reason or safety consideration, placed the plane in a flight regime that likely exceeded the airplane's certified flight envelope. Which means that the flight crew didn't really have to make the plane climb so drastically, and in doing so, the plane was put through what it was not designed to do. Moreover, the investigators determined that their willingness to climb to 41,000 feet was dictated by personal and not operational reasons. Pinnacle Airlines requires a climb to 41,000 be made at 250 knots. But while climbing from 37,000 feet to 41,000 feet, their speed dropped from 203 knots all the way down to 163. This was because they asked the autopilot to climb at 500 feet per minute, but the plane just didn't have the thrust to climb at 500 feet per minute while maintaining 250 knots. This is why they lost so much speed. They should have climbed the airplane in airspeed mode rather than the vertical speed mode. This meant that they reached 41,000 feet in a critically low energy state. The pilots did realize that their performance at 41,000 feet was deteriorating, but neither pilot made any inputs to rectify the situation. As they were talking to the controller about a lower altitude, the stick shaker and the stick pusher activated. The pilots initially pulled back on the control column, which caused the nose of the airplane to pitch up to 29 degrees. Then they brought the nose down, and this is when the left rolling motion began. During all of this, the airflow to the engines had been disrupted, and then the engines flamed out. A reason why the pilots did what they did can be traced back to a stall recovery method that is used widely in the aviation industry, including at Pinnacle Airlines. The pilots were trained to apply power to restore the energy state of the airplane and to maintain altitude. In this accident, the pilot's input could have been the result of their attempt to recover using a minimal altitude loss recovery technique. After the engines had failed, there was a noticeable delay in the crew starting the restart checklist. The checklist asked the crew to use a windmill restart between 21,000 and 13,000 feet. For this, they needed to hold the plane at a -8 degree pitch down attitude as the plane accelerated to about 300 knots. This would spin up the turbines and would help with the restart. However, the crew did not hold the plane at -8 degrees and the pitch down was not sustained. This meant that the turbines were not rotating at all. The captain should have taken control from the first officer and accelerated the plane to 300 knots, but that did not happen. Since the windmill restart procedure did not work, the crew decided to try an APU-assisted restart at 13,000 feet. They tried an APU restart 4 times, but it did not work. The investigators learned that the cores of both engines had locked. The engines of the plane were under high thermal stress. That is, they were worked so hard to get the plane up to 41,000 feet that this caused the temperatures inside the engine to skyrocket. Combined with the cold air at 41,000 feet, the parts inside the engine cooled at different rates when the engines had shut down. A jet engine is built to exact standards, and now that the hot engine was being cooled by the cold air at 41,000 feet, different parts contracted at different rates, which caused the parts of the jet engine to not fit into each other anymore. This meant that the core of the engine could not rotate freely, thereby killing all hopes of a jet engine restart. Another aspect of this crash that I'd like to look at is the crew's communication with the controller. After both engines had failed, the crew took 14 minutes to let the controllers know about the failure. They told the controller that they had just lost one engine. The controller says, "Understand, controlled flight on a single engine right now," and no one corrects the controller. Had the captain told the controller about the double engine failure, the controller would have helped guide the plane to an airport within its glide range, of which there were 5. The crew only told the controller that they had a double engine failure when they were at 10,000 feet, and by that time they only had one airport within their glide range, and they had already overflown it. It was clear at this point that they would not be able to make it to Jefferson City Memorial Airport. Multiple opportunities existed during the descent for the pilots to talk with controllers and between themselves about the need to make an emergency landing. The pilots acted in a manner that was not consistent with ensuring safety of flight or effectively managing an in-flight emergency. The safety board concluded that the pilot's failure to prepare for an emergency landing in a timely manner, including communicating with air traffic controllers immediately after the emergency about the loss of both engines and the availability of landing site, was a result of their intentional non-compliance with standard operating procedures, and this failure was causal to the accident. In this accident, a string of bad decisions was made to make a bad situation worse, and by not being forthcoming about their situation, the pilots sealed their own fate. Flying at 41,000 feet, in my opinion, was not the cause of this accident. Getting to 41,000 feet by ignoring procedures is what made this routine flight spiral into chaos. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to iTrapper for letting me use his amazing footage on my video. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. I'll catch you guys next time.